Disney threw her under the bus, but I mean, not unjustifiably so. You can't be like, Rachel Zegler's innocent and all this. She did no damage to the box office. We're seeing it because of her.
As the controversy raged online, tensions behind the scenes boiled over into full-blown disaster. What started as subtle friction between Snow White's two lead actresses, Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot, quickly escalated into something far more explosive. At first, their differences were easy to ignore. Gadot, an established A-list star, had already cemented her place in Hollywood with Wonder Woman, while Zegler was still trying to prove herself after West Side Story. But as press interviews began, it became clear that these two weren't on the same page, not even close.
BBC said Disney's Snow White has a major identity crisis. I mean, guys, every single one of these reviews is just absolutely brutal. And what you also need to know is that these are not politically driven reviews. I mean, most of them are from the camp that should be supporting Disney, that should be behind this new progressive take on Snow White.
During one interview, Zegler spoke about how her version of Snow White wouldn't be the damsel in distress of the original film, emphasizing that her character wouldn't be saved by the prince. Sitting next to her, Gadot politely smiled, but body language experts later analyzed the footage.
Something is going on behind the scenes with almost every major animation, video game, and movie studio that they're doing this intentionally or something. I don't f***ing know. I'm not even gonna talk about this. People are like, oh wow, Snow White flopped. Who is surprised? You cast arguably the least genuine, most out of touch, and disliked person in her industry, and her industry is Hollywood.
Pointing out subtle signs of discomfort. Tense shoulders, forced laughter, a look that screamed, "Please stop talking." The contrast between them was undeniable. Gadot, professional and composed, answered questions with careful precision, while Zegler, brash and dismissive, seemed to dig herself deeper into controversy with every new statement.
And the Disney movie, remember she was out like a couple years ago being like, there's certainly not going to be a prince rescuing me, I can tell you that. And then even Disney got on its heels and they're like, we're going to reshoot the movie immediately. Like, we're going to make some changes.
But it was what happened off camera that sent shockwaves through the production. The breaking point came during a private recording session meant to capture the film's director's commentary. These sessions are usually routine. Actors sit down, discuss key moments, and offer insights for fans. But this one never even made it past the first few minutes. According to verified reports, Zegler and Gadot got into a full-blown argument that ended with executives physically separating them. It started with a disagreement over the film's messaging. Zegler allegedly insisted that Disney should push a stronger feminist narrative, while Gadot argued that keeping some elements of the original fairy tale was necessary.
Greatest Disney box office bomb in the history, Disney live-action remakes, but certainly also the end of her career.
But then the fight took a political turn. During filming, the Snow White controversy had already become a battleground for political debates, with online communities divided over the film's modernized themes. But behind the scenes, the real tension exploded when Zegler reportedly demanded that Gadot refrain from speaking about her support for Israel during press appearances. Gadot, who has never shied away from discussing her background, refused outright.
Rachel Zegler is not doing anything to silence all of those reports, rumors, and online chatter that she and Gal Gadot are beefing. Yes, beefing.
The conversation quickly turned heated. Voices were raised, and within minutes, the entire session fell apart. Reports confirmed that executives tried to de-escalate the situation, but it was too late. The damage was done. Disney was now faced with a PR nightmare happening in real time. And this wasn't the only problem. While the cast clashed behind the scenes, test screenings were going even worse. Disney executives expected some backlash, but they were blindsided by just how disastrous the audience reactions were.
Snow White, budget $250 million, box office $43 million. Oh, but it's only been 2 days, give it a chance. No, I'm not gonna give it a chance. I'm not even talking about that number. Because like all the flops are unsurprising at this.
Viewers laughed at emotional scenes, cringed at the new character designs, and left overwhelmingly negative feedback. One anonymous test viewer described the experience as watching a movie that couldn't decide what it wanted to be, half fairy tale, half awkward social commentary, and neither done well. The Snow White remake was supposed to be a visually stunning, empowering reimagining of a classic.
There's nothing wrong with wanting a man. Can we not have chivalry in this world anymore? There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what? I'd love for a man to come scoop me up and provide for me.
Instead, it was shaping up to be one of Disney's biggest disasters. In a last-ditch effort to fix the film, Disney ordered emergency reshoots. But there was a problem. The Hollywood strikes had already begun. With actors and writers refusing to work, production was thrown into chaos, forcing the studio to rely on unfinished footage and rushed edits. Even worse, the film's CGI-heavy sequences looked incomplete, giving Snow White an awkward, artificial feel. As one insider put it, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this movie, and somehow it still looks like a student project. And then came the moment of truth, the final trailer. This was Disney's last chance to change the public's perception, but instead of turning things around, it confirmed every fan's worst fears. The dwarves were nowhere to be seen. The prince was completely erased.
I find myself speechless in the midst of this. Another 4 years of hatred, leaning us towards a world I do not want to live in, leaning us towards a world that will be hard to raise my daughter in. P.S. She has no daughter.
The film's color palette was dark and washed out, a far cry from the vibrant wonder of the 1937 classic. And the worst part? The backlash was bigger than ever. Within hours, the trailer had hundreds of thousands of dislikes, with comment sections filled with furious fans calling for a boycott. The internet had spoken. This was going to be a disaster. Disney had seen bad publicity before, but this was different. The Little Mermaid remake had controversy. The Marvels had underperformed. But Snow White wasn't just struggling. It was being actively rejected by audiences before it even hit theaters. And for the first time, Disney executives were faced with a terrifying realization. They might have just created one of the biggest box office bombs of all time.
Seems like Rachel Zegler's heart is shady. Or perhaps she doesn't give an F. To celebrate the film's release, she took to social media and shared this post with 13 pictures from the making of the movie.
Rachel Zegler thought she was stepping into the role of a lifetime, a Disney princess, a legacy character, the star of a billion-dollar franchise. But instead of fairy tale magic, she walked straight into a nightmare. The Snow White remake, once positioned as one of Disney's biggest live-action projects, became a complete disaster before it even hit theaters. The backlash wasn't just bad, it was unprecedented. Audiences turned against the film months before its release, and when the first trailer dropped, the damage was irreversible. The internet exploded with criticism, not just about the movie's bizarre creative choices, but about Zegler herself. Instead of embracing the beloved 1937 classic, she mocked it in interviews, calling it outdated, cringeworthy, and irrelevant. She dismissed the original story's core romance, claiming her Snow White doesn't need a prince, and that the love story was weird. That might have played well with modern Hollywood executives, but to the millions of Disney fans who grew up with Snow White, it was a slap in the face.
I just have to note the smugness and superiority on this 23, 25, something like that, girl's face. Young, a little bit of humility, you know? This is a story that's been around for a long, long time. You're not improving on it.
This wasn't an actress excited to honor a legendary film. This was someone who seemed to hate the very role she was cast to play. Disney had already faced backlash for controversial remakes, but this was different. The anger wasn't just coming from small pockets of critics. It was widespread. Every new trailer, every interview, every behind-the-scenes clip only fueled the fire. YouTube comment sections were flooded with dislikes. Fan forums were filled with outrage. Disney's social media pages were bombarded with complaints. It was clear, audiences weren't excited about this movie. They were furious. But instead of addressing concerns, Disney executives doubled down.
A cartoon character that was voiced in the 30s has more humanity and charm than the actual person who was filmed on screen in live action. That's a problem.
Dismissing complaints as toxic fandom and assuming people would show up to the theaters anyway. That turned out to be a massive miscalculation. The biggest red flag? The mysterious disappearance of the 7 dwarves. Early promotional images revealed that Disney had replaced the iconic characters with a group of diverse, non-dwarf actors, a decision that baffled and angered fans. The backlash was so intense that in later trailers, Disney quietly removed them from marketing materials. It was as if they were trying to hide their own film. But the internet never forgets, and the damage was already done. People weren't just disappointed, they were actively rooting for the movie to fail. And then came the bombshell reports from inside Disney. Studio executives were in full-blown panic mode. Test screenings had been an absolute disaster. Audiences laughed at dramatic moments. The CGI looked unfinished and sloppy.
Backlash to her arrogance and just inanity. Well, she's back, and she's very, very upset about the Trump win, okay?
The new storyline, one that completely erased Prince Charming and turned Snow White into a girl boss figure leading a rebellion, was ridiculed for feeling forced and awkward. But Disney had already gone too far down this road. There was no turning back. Instead of admitting mistakes, they threw more money at the problem, hoping that last-minute edits and reshoots would salvage the film. But it was too late. The internet had made up its mind. Rachel Zegler wasn't a beloved Disney princess. She was the face of Hollywood's worst instincts: arrogance, disrespect for classic storytelling, the belief that audiences would swallow whatever they were given, no matter how much it strayed from the original. As the release date got closer, the energy surrounding Snow White wasn't excitement, it was morbid curiosity. How bad would it flop? How much money would Disney lose? Could this be the movie that finally forces Hollywood to rethink its approach to remakes? The stage was set for one of the biggest cinematic disasters in recent memory, but what happened next was even worse than anyone expected. The moment of truth arrived. After months of controversy, backlash, and disastrous test screenings, Snow White finally hit theaters. But instead of the triumphant release Disney had once envisioned, it was an unmitigated catastrophe. Opening weekend numbers rolled in, and they weren't just bad. They were historically awful. Analysts had projected a week debut, but the actual figures were even worse than the most pessimistic estimates. The film pulled in a fraction of what it needed to break even, making it one of the worst-performing live-action Disney remakes ever. Theaters reported empty seats, showings were canceled due to lack of interest. Even in international markets, where Disney usually relied on strong overseas box office numbers, audiences simply weren't interested. The message was clear. Snow White was dead on arrival. Behind the scenes, Disney executives were in full-blown panic mode. Emergency meetings were held. Marketing campaigns were abruptly scaled back as the company tried to minimize further losses. Merchandise, plush dolls, t-shirts, posters, piled up unsold in stores, forcing retailers to slash prices to clearance levels just to get rid of the stock. Some locations even pulled the merchandise entirely, unwilling to waste shelf space on a movie no one wanted. And then came the final humiliation. Theaters started dropping the movie entirely after just a few weeks, replacing it with older films that could actually bring in audiences. The numbers were bad, but the public response was even worse. Social media eviscerated the film. Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube were flooded with scathing reviews, brutal memes, and endless compilations of awkward scenes. Clips of Rachel Zegler's interviews resurfaced, reigniting the backlash all over again. Even mainstream media outlets, some of which had initially defended the movie, began to acknowledge just how colossal the failure was. The BBC published an article calling the film a stunning misfire and criticizing Disney's decision to modernize a story that didn't need fixing. Forbes labeled it one of Disney's biggest miscalculations in years. And The Hollywood Reporter ran a scathing review questioning whether Disney had permanently damaged its reputation with audiences. But what made this disaster even worse was that it wasn't just a loss for Snow White. It was a wake-up call for Disney itself. For years, the company had been banking on nostalgia-fueled remakes, assuming audiences would show up no matter what changes were made. But Snow White proved that audiences weren't just rejecting this one film. They were rejecting Disney's entire approach to storytelling. They didn't want soulless, politically driven reimaginings of beloved classics. They wanted magic, they wanted heart, and they weren't getting it. With the failure of Snow White, Disney was now staring down a terrifying reality. If even one of their most iconic princesses could bomb this hard, what did that mean for their future projects? Would audiences ever trust them again? The studio had spent years alienating its fan base, and now it was paying the price. The real question wasn't just how much money they had lost, it was whether they could ever recover from it. But what happened next sealed the movie's fate forever. Early test screenings were a complete disaster. Audience members reportedly laughed at emotional moments, mocked the CGI, and left scathing feedback. One test viewer claimed that the final act felt like two completely different movies stitched together. Disney tried to fix it, last-minute digital edits, rushed reshoots, but it was too late. The damage was done. The film premiered to overwhelmingly negative reviews. And then the box office numbers started rolling in. The opening weekend was a catastrophe, bringing in just a fraction of what Disney had projected. The company was now facing a massive financial loss, with analysts estimating it could cost Disney hundreds of millions in revenue. Then, things got even worse. The film's downfall became a public relations nightmare. Memes flooded social media. Disney fans, critics, even mainstream outlets ripped into the movie. The BBC labeled it a Marxist call to arms, criticizing its heavy-handed messaging. Meanwhile, Hollywood insiders began questioning whether Rachel Zegler was still bankable as a leading actress. Studios that once considered her for future blockbuster roles were now backing away, fearing she had become too controversial. And then came the final humiliation, Disney's desperate attempt to bury the film. Just weeks after release, theaters started pulling screenings, replacing Snow White with older, more successful films. Merchandise sales were non-existent, with stores slashing prices to get rid of unwanted stock. Industry experts now predict that Disney will silently dump the movie onto Disney Plus, hoping the controversy fades over time. But this disaster isn't just about one failed movie. It's about what Disney has become. A studio that once built its empire on timeless storytelling has lost its way, pushing divisive ideas that alienate audiences. The downfall of Snow White is a warning sign. Hollywood is changing, and not for the better. The real question is, will they learn from this? Or will the next big remake be another train wreck waiting to happen?